Our focus this week was on business history and understanding how some of the practices that are characteristic of management came into being, and a lot of things that happened in this early period of industrialization, that 1880 to 1920, had a big impact on how people thought about enterprises, how management was conducted in enterprises, and some of that is with us today. What we first talked about were the changes that occurred in the business environment in this period of time, and there were some very significant and important ones that fundamentally changed the way that business firms were organized. And the biggest development of this period was the emergence of new transportation technologies, the railroads. The railroads allowed goods to be moved over long distances fairly quickly, also allowed goods that were quite heavy to be transported that had been enormously difficult previously. And so previously, certainly large heavy things had been moved. They were typically moved by water. And water, the challenge of it is you could dig canals, but it's quite difficult, laborious, and expensive. And with the railroads, you can really get point to point. You can build a way to transport to and connect all parts of the nation. And as a result, markets expanded significantly. And with the expansion of markets, really for the first time, we have a capacity for every enterprise to realize economies of scale. Previously, you could have economies of scale, but you couldn't sell everything you produced. Suddenly, you can reach markets, you can achieve economies of scale that are associated with ramping up the size of the production enterprise. And so as a result, enterprises that were successful and could address market demand got much bigger. This led to a fundamental change in what were the social realities of how workplaces operated. So, in the craft period, before the emergence of the factory system, things were very personal. You had craftspeople who lived in a community, owners who lived in the community. Everybody probably went to church together, they shopped together, their kids went to school together. There was this high integration of what happened in the workplace with what happened in the community. When enterprises got very large, then we suddenly start to have supervisors and workers who live in different communities. The scale and reach of the enterprise in the community for its workforce is quite extended. And the personalization, the very personal sets of relationships that had governed workplace practice disappeared. They just weren't there anymore. And the nature of the relationships between the people in the workforce, and in particular the people who ran the businesses, we said is very depersonalized. Um, and there was a change in how work was organized. Instead of organizing the production system around the skill set of locally available labor, what we started to see was that people were hired and trained to fit specific jobs. There was this notion that people became cogs in the machine of production. And so suddenly workers had to fit the job. The job didn't fit the workers. And in the midst of this, I think what we can see is a lot of experimentation and trying to understand how to best manage the workplace. And the management methods that emerged at some point, look actually quite inhumane and cruel. If we saw some of that in the documentary on the Ford Motor Company, but people were really struggling, and people in charge, on how do we make these big enterprises work effectively? How do we manage to hire and train people? Even became a huge issue when enterprises start to get on the scale, instead of 100 workers to have thousands of workers. These were not things that were easy to figure out, and a lot of experimentation and a lot of bad practices. Frederick Taylor, we read an article by him, was the person who came up with the ideas and techniques of scientific management. And his notion was to bring systematic evaluation of work methods in the design of work and in the design of organizations. So instead of going with rule of thumb of conventional practice, he said, let's test it. Let's test what works best. I think Frederick Taylor tends to get maybe unfairly characterized as kind of the thought thinker behind a very oppressive work environment. That really wasn't his intention, and certainly Taylorism, as it was applied, was very different than his intention. And one could have a lot of criticism of Taylorism, but I hope your reading of Frederick Taylor actually showed he really was trying to figure out a way to make work a fair deal, to both benefit workers and to benefit the owners, but as we talked about in class, the human dimension on both sides, on how workers responded to this, how owners responded to it, ultimately was the undoing of the pure approach to scientific management. In this time, as we also talked about, was a period of tremendous unrest and violence in the workplace that was certainly very disturbing, for the general public. It was certainly disturbing for the people involved in it, and it was something that people had never seen before. And it's partly because of suddenly the scales of the enterprises and the conflicts and the nature of the conflicts between groups of thousands of people was unprecedented. And people at the time even talked about labor warfare, revolution, and so it was enormously disturbing, and people were trying to figure out better ways of doing this, and also just understanding things like the learning curve. They started to say, well, these huge turnover rates are very damaging to us. How do we, better organize and manage to have more productivity, and then also to have a workforce that is violently reacting is not a good thing either. In the midst of this period of turbulence, um, Western Electric Corporation, which was the equipment manufacturing arm of AT&T, was doing some experiments with lighting systems. They wanted a very natural question, right? If we have got new, better lighting available, how do we deploy it? What's the kind of best level of lighting to impact productivity? The thing that we talked about and really was stunning to people was they did this experiment and they did it well, and they tried to reverse the effect because they initially showed a productivity effect. The workers got to the point they were working by what is effectively moonlight and setting record productivities levels. This was stunning to people. And how could this possibly be? What is it that is going on? And that was just the starting point for several years of intensive study. And one of the core ideas that came out of this, which was led by a group of Harvard business professors, was this realization that there's something called the informal organization, that there is a social structure. Probably shouldn't have been surprising. There was a social structure always before. People just didn't think of it. They were embedded in it. And that social structure of the community still existed in the workplace. It didn't exist in the same way, but that there was an informal organization, and that the people in that informal organization, the parallel authority system, um, you know, did things that sometimes were in the interest of the enterprise, the interest of management, and sometimes not. One of the things that these studies identified was the existence of informal leaders. And this was, for people who own businesses, very disturbing, right? You've picked a supervisor, you promoted a supervisor, you expect that supervisor to be scheduling work and determining work practices, and then somebody tells you, well, actually there's an informal leader, might even be somebody you don't like very much, thinks is a bad attitude, and they're pretty much dictating everything that happens in the work group. This really, really bothered people. Now, their first response, which was proved to be very ineffective, was to try and train supervisors to become that informal leader, to take over the social system. This had all sorts of it was a bad idea for all sorts of reasons. One of which is the informal social system extends to and involves a lot of things that are not related to work practice. It also got, management intervening in petty kind of issues. It really distracted, if anything, distracted the supervisor, and it's just really not the way to respond. But at the same time, really what we want to do is not own the informal system. We want to engage people in the organization, in their work, and that doesn't necessarily mean capture the informal system. Out of all this emerged a field that we call organizational behavior, and you'll see a lot of your readings refer to organizational behavior. And it is a scientific discipline. We do studies, we do experiments, we do field studies, we do direct observation in workplaces to try and understand, how this informal social system works, how people work in the workplace, how they relate to the workplace, the appropriate role for leadership and management, all with an objective of making our organizations work better. And we are going to, again, talk a lot about this. We've just introduced kind of the basic ideas. We've seen and discussed issues of how information flows in the organization, the problems with that, how workers relate to the workplace, their kind of voluntary compliance and enthusiasm for their work versus holding back, and how that can actually impact the profitability of the firm. And we're quite interested in being able to, as leaders, make a difference on the positive side for our organization. On the further reading that's mentioned here, Alfred Chandler's book, The Visible Hand, is really a major piece of business history. It's probably the defining business history of the 20th century. And The Visible Hand is middle management. And this is a play on the notion of the invisible hand of the market. The visible hand are the positions and the people that really make organizations work. And how did those positions come into being? And what were the challenges of developing the organization systems, the structures, the management positions and specializations that made enterprises competitive and effective in what they did? So, for instance, when organizations got extremely large, there was a tremendous difficulty in understanding profitability. The information systems, the record keeping systems, it's hard to even call them accounting systems, that existed in the craft workshop tended to be the owner counting the money in the till. And to have tremendous amounts of capital deployed and invested, and are they making money, was extremely difficult problem. And Chandler has an entire chapter on the development of accounting, and it is fascinating. He also provides a lot of insight into why the original big accounting firms were all Scottish. Pretty simple answer, because the capital was British. And British Capital wanted their accounting firms to come to the United States and watch out for their money. So fascinating book, all focused on the development of large-scale enterprise, and really focuses on the period kind of after the factory system, 1920 up into about 1960, when modern management practices are emerging. Daniel Nelson's book, Managers and Workers, has a really good chapter on Taylorism. He also has some very good information in a couple of chapters on factory architecture, and in particular on how power systems influence what was possible, how the transition from the water wheel as a power system to steam power, where there's a large steam engine that ran the plant. That was a fairly smooth and seamless transition, because you all, in both cases, had a centralized power source, to the impact on electrification and the capacity to organize the workflow based on what made most sense for productivity versus the constraints of how power was collected and distributed in the plant. Finally, Upton Sinclair is a novel. The Jungle is about the meat packing industry. It is about the challenges of the workers in that industry, the work environment in that industry. In the early days of industrialization, the meatpacking line is a deconstruction line, and it's often said Henry Ford got his idea for the assembly line from the disassembly line of the meatpacking and how that was done. And Sinclair commented on his novel, which became a huge public sensation, that he aimed for America's heart and he hit him in the stomach. So he aimed for America's heart and the plight of the workforce, and what happened is people were appalled at how their food was handled. And the lack of sanitation, the lack of control over what made it into the food supply. This book was directly led to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, a lot of food safety and health safety kind of restrictions. And then also there were things about worker safety. There was lots of things going on around worker safety, but Upton Sinclair did hit America in the stomach. But it's a fascinating kind of moment and capture of the what could be the cruelty, the inhumanity that was happening in the workplace as people struggled to kind of figure out how to more effectively run these organizations. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that a lot of bad people got in charge. They didn't. But their capacity to manage and control was lagged well behind how quickly these enterprises grew, the scale to which they grew. They had a workforce willing to put up with pretty bad environment, and developing the better way to do it took a lot of time, it took a lot of ingenuity, and there is inventiveness in leadership practice and management practice, and we hope we give some insights to you about that in this course.